Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live stream with Matt Pietrek and Demerara Distillers. We have Shaun Caleb here. We have Sharon Sue-Hang here. Really exciting to have two such knowledgeable figures from the rum world in one place at the same time. My name is Will Hookinga from Zavvi.co, and we're going to get started in just a minute. Before we do, I want to give you the lay of the land real quick. So on your right, you'll see a chat window over there. I know some of you are already saying hello. That's great to see. So feel free to pop in anytime. Tell us where you're watching from, what's on your mind. If you have a question at any point during the presentation, you'll want to enter that in the question box at the bottom of your screen. Matt, Shaun, and Sharon are going to save some time at the end for questions. So that's the best place to make sure we see them. And lastly, please share the event with friends. There's a share button at the top of your screen. You can click that and share the link on Facebook, Twitter, wherever your friends are hanging out, and invite them to come join us. So with all that said, I'm going to turn things over to Matt Pietrek right now, who you probably know from cocktailwonk.com. He's also the community envoy for WIRSPA, which is partly what brought us all here together in the first place. So Matt, tell us a little bit about what we're going to be learning today.
Yes, thanks, Will. So my role here is as the WIRSPA Community Envoy. If you're not familiar with WIRSPA, it is the West Indies Rum and Spirits Producers Association. It's a group of rum-producing countries that work collectively on things that benefit the rum industry as a whole. And when this COVID thing hit, I was chatting with Vaughn, the CEO of WIRSPA, and we said, you know, lots of people are out there doing live streams and online and whatever. And I think this is a great opportunity to introduce the rum community to some of the people behind the brands. You know, like we love brand ambassadors and marketing people, but you know, like us rum nerds really want to see and meet and talk to the people who are making the rum. And so we've hatched a series of sessions bringing some of your favorite rum producers and the people who are actually making the rum. So we started out first with, we are starting out first with Demerara Distillers Limited, who I'm very excited about. Actually visited DDL in Guyana back last September or October, I forget when, but visited DDL, saw the distillery, saw the aging warehouse, also spent quite a bit of time with Shaun and Sharon, interviewed them, and so it's great to see them again, you know, although remotely. So that's sort of a little bit background of what we're doing here and sort of my connection here. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Shaun and Sharon. Sharon, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your role at DDL?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone who is looking. My name is Sharon Sue-Hang, and I'm El Dorado Master Blender. I've been at Demerara for over 20 years. And my role is ensuring that El Dorado is consistent and be the best rum in the world. Yes.
Okay. And so would some people would have say you're the master blender role?
Yes. That's why I introduced myself as the El Dorado Master Blender.
Oh, that's right. Okay, you're right. Okay, excellent. Sorry. Okay, and Shaun.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for the lead into this session and for hosting Demerara Distillers as the first among the WIRSPA colleagues. Hi to everyone out in the audience who's looking at us. I'm Shaun Caleb, the Master Distiller for El Dorado. I've been with the company for 13 years, so not quite as long as Sharon, but hopefully I am able to make up in other ways by producing good enough rums that give her the joy to do what she does. So it's a pleasure, and I hope that during the conversation we get to talk a lot about what we do here at Demerara Distillers.
Yeah, this is great. I think since we only have an hour or so, let's jump right in and get some technical content. So let's start going through some slides.
All right, so I will take it first by talking through some of the technical aspects of our production program, and then Sharon will talk about our product. So without further ado, I think most persons would know where Demerara Distillers is located. We are in South America. The next slide, right? South America on that northern coast. So we are equatorial, we're South American, but we're also Caribbean. So our geography, our history, our people is very much a fusion of all of these influences. More specifically, the Demerara region where the rums are produced brings together all of these influences. And so today we focus a lot on the Demerara category of rums we produce. They're rums that are exclusively produced in this region, and they come exclusively from sugarcane substrates, which gives them their well-defined sugarcane aromas and flavors that Demerara rums are known for. To talk a bit about our process, starting first with the fermentation, I should say that every Guyanese kind of owes their history in coming to Guyana to sugar and by extension rum. And so for us, this is more than a process. This is also our history and our legacy. And we take great pride in preserving that history in all of our traditional processes, starting first with our molasses, all the way through to our fermentation. At the current time, most of our molasses comes from the local sugar estates, but there is a need at the moment to supplement with an occasional import of molasses, usually from Mexico, to ensure that there's sufficient volumes to meet our full production program. Whichever source of molasses we use, however, we're able to make the adjustments in our process to be able to come out with the same product at the end of the day. If I can tell you a bit about our fermentation process to start with. So right from the bat, we use standard dry yeast, so no specially cultured yeast. However, because of how the molasses that is locally sourced is cultivated and harvested, and also because of the natural environment, it has a bevy of wild yeast and spores that are naturally abundant and spread. Those participate in the fermentation process. So our fermentation beer is actually enriched not only because of the activity of the main dry yeast, but also because of all of the natural presence of these wild native yeast species that help to extend into various side reactions that produce a whole bevy of flavor producing components. The next slide, I just give a sampling of some of those. We have been able to actually, at one stage, not isolate, but identify as many as over 200 different flavor-inducing components. But on a consistent basis, we keep track of the main ones that are important for ensuring the consistency in the flavor profile of our product. And they range from the low boiling heads to the heavier alcohols and acids to the range of esters and aldehydes and ketones that are important for flavor. And some of those are listed there. So acetaldehyde, for example, is known to be typically pungent, fruity, a bit of a leafy green. So whenever in our product, we're looking for a hint of that affect, we can manipulate the amount of acetaldehyde that comes through. Same for the amount of acetal if we're looking for a green, but with a more of a woody, solventy affect. In terms of the esters,
Shaun, are those the notes like we would get from, say, a Port Morant distillate?
From all of the distillates.
Okay.
But it becomes a synergy between all of the different components that are present and the net effect on flavor. Usually for the lighter components, to be able to detect those flavors in a much more pronounced manner, we'd have to pretty much make the body light. Otherwise, competition from other components would tend to change the overall character of the rums. For example, we have a light rum that is noted for having a very fresh minty with a hint of coconut, a little bit of creamy white chocolate sort of notes. So this is a light rum, and to be able to produce that, we have to be able to isolate the specific components that contribute to those flavors in the right amount, and only those components. And those components all happen to be on the lighter end of the spectrum, those low boiling heads. So that's a case where if we want to have those effects come through a bit more organically, we kind of have to restrict to one portion of the chemistry of the congenite profile, as opposed to the heavier rums from the Port Morant, where we have a lot more flexibility. So we can introduce a lot more flavors and therefore go deeper in the spectrum of flavor components. All right. To tell you, for example, there's one of our heavy/medium body type of rum that has a pronounced almond aroma. And we have found that, there's a particular heavier aldehyde that contributes that flavor. So in that case, we extend the distillation profile to extract those components as well. So it's not just the lighter components, but also this particular component. And so on balance, then the rounded marzipan kind of sweet balance with almond comes together in a very lively way. All right, so there's a lot of flavor chemistry that we're able to play around with. And I think that there's an important point that needs to be made here. The way we distill, the rums are produced from distills directly with their full flavor profile. That's important because it means we have to have an understanding of what components contribute specifically to that particular flavor profile. And sometimes there are synergies between components. And so we have to be able to balance those different components in the right proportions to get it just right. It also means that we have a lot of flexibility. Our fermented beer, as I mentioned earlier, because it's so rich with literally hundreds of components, it gives us sort of that library to choose from. And so that is why among our different stills, we are able to distill so many different marks of rum, because we are given the flexibility to select from a wide range those specific components that contribute the flavors we're looking for. To talk a bit more about the stills, so we have 9 different types of stills on our property, more than a dozen in terms of actual number of stills, but 9 different types. Some of the types of stills are replicated. So we have, for example, 2 Saval stills and 3 coffee stills, etc. As I mentioned just now, we very closely focus on the flavor and aromas, and we try to replicate the dominant profile in every batch of rum from every specific still, which means that each still has its own thumbprint, its own identity in terms of the product it produces. And by replicating that for each batch, it ensures that at the point where we get to blending, there's a lot more predictability. So for instance, if Sharon is looking for a blend of 3 rums, let's say 1 light, 1 medium bodied, 1 heavy, because there is that consistency in producing each of the 3 components, she has a lot more certainty and a lot more reliability that once she gets to blend, she's able to do so to replicate what she's looking for with a lot more degree of consistency. So that's important for us.
So Shaun, really quick question. You were talking about the stills and how they each have their own flavor profile. But as I understand it, you're pretty much using the same fermentation for all of them. You're not doing distinct fermentations for each of them. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct. There is only one still that has its own fermentation process, and that's our Hyester process. We don't focus a lot on the Hyester process. So that typically takes 3 months, the entire process, from the point of allowing the beer to ferment, to allow the addition of the special acid mixture that then takes the esterification process to completion for another 6 weeks. And at the end of that, we are able to produce a Hyester product that is unique because it's sort of unimodal, where there's a very high presence of esters, but without a very long tail, as might be produced in other territories. So we're unique in that way. Save and except for that Hyester process, all of our other rums are fermented the same way. Same yeast, same process, same tanks. In fact, the stills are fed simultaneously. It's only that the production scheme that is utilized on each still creates a different flavor profile, and therefore the sensory impact.
Yeah, I suspect we'll come back to high ester questions later, but keep going.
All right. So to talk through some of the stills that we have, I want to first highlight our heritage stills. The oldest and perhaps the most famous of them is our Port Moran double wooden pot still, which dates back to 1732. This today we believe is the oldest still that is still in operation. It's made entirely of wood, except for the gooseneck pipes that connect the two pots. And the process is fairly straightforward. So the liquid in each of the pots are heated by steam that is charged directly into the liquid to allow for for evaporation to take place. The vapor that is emitted is cooled and condensed on that overhead gooseneck pipe, which is made of copper. That copper is important for a couple of reasons. Apart from being useful in the condensation, it also helps to strip out a lot of the sulfur and the lighter components that may contribute flavors that we're not looking for. And it also accelerates the esterification process, which produces a lot more flavor components, those rich esters that we ascribe a lot of flavors to. Because of that repeated condensation, however, what that does is to force the entire distillation process to take a lot longer. So one batch for us can take up to 16 hours, as opposed to a continuous distillation process where an equivalent quantity would be distilled in less than 1 hour. The result of that, however, is that it allows for a much higher pressure of product to build up within the column. And as we say, a rising tide lifts all boats. So not only would the lighter components in that instance be eventually evaporated and over, but also some of the heavier components. The net effect is that the wood in combination with the condensation on the copper gooseneck helps to ensure that a much bigger body of product is produced. It's full-bodied with a wider range of heavier components that can be found in any of our continuous stills. But that's on the pot side. We also have a single wooden pot which operates on the same principle. And however, because it's a single pot and therefore a single batch process, it's not quite as heavy as the double wooden pot. Beyond the pot stills, we have column stills of various makes. Our most famous is the Envoy wooden column still. It's a 2-column still, first built in 1880 at Plantation Envoy. It was based on the original 1830 blueprint that was patented by Aeneas Coffee when coffee stills were first introduced back in Scotland. The difference here is that it's a continuously fed still, and therefore product is continuously produced from the columns. As a result, it doesn't rely on a buildup of vapor pressure as would the pot stills, and therefore there isn't as much of the heavier components that are filtered through into the final product. However, in addition to the wood, there are copper coils that are woven through each layer of the coffee stills. That copper helps to condense esters, help to produce more esters, and as a result, it produces a lot more delicate flavor and the aromatic spectrum of fruity and floral notes that really enhances the overall bouquet of the product. So in short, it's medium bodied, not as heavy as the pot, but with a lot more of those aromatic esters that we like. Beyond the wooden stills, we have a number of metal stills, starting first with our 4-column French Saval still, which was first installed at Plantation Iflot. This dates back to the...
No, you said that, not the pronunciation. Most rum nerds have no idea how to say it.
Okay, so it's Iflot?
Yeah, Iflot, yes.
And so that 4-column still can be operated in various modes. So in the 18th century, there were a number of these stills on different plantations. Of course, many of those stills were decommissioned, but fortunately for us, 2 of them were kept in operation, and both ended up at Iflot at one stage. I mentioned that bit of history because although it's the same still, on the different plantations, they were operated differently. And so in the 1930s, in 1920s, when the operations were consolidated at Iflot with the Saval stills, an attempt was made to replicate stills, the products that were made on Saval stills on other estates, which meant that the Saval still was therefore operated in different ways to produce the products that would have been made using Saval stills on other estates. To give you an example, so one estate might produce a light rum with a tropical green fruit note, and therefore one would imagine that some rectification is involved in that process, in which case all 4 columns get used. Another estate might have utilized only 3 of those columns because perhaps the quality of rum they were looking for is different. If, for example, they're looking for a more medium body type rum with sweeter notes, so sugarcane, caramel, and notes along that spectrum, rectification might be less important. And so in that case, they may choose to operate only 3 of those columns, or maybe they had only 3 columns in that estate. Another estate, still might produce a more heavier type of rum with a very particular note. Let us say, for instance, I talked about formaldehyde and how it leads to that almond note. Perhaps the note that estate produced was dominant in that note because of how it was produced. Well, when all of this was moved to iFlood, there was an attempt to replicate the production of those various estates rums on this single still. It was a way of consolidating the operation to bring all of that history into one place. Of course, we at Demerara Distillers today have preserved that heritage. And so that French Saval still is today able to produce over 9 different types of rums, ranging from light rums to medium body to heavy rums, with a range of different flavor profiles, each of which harkens back to the particular rum that was produced on an estate that we have tried to replicate for almost for over a century. Finally, at Diamond Distillery, where of course Demerara Distillers is currently housed, the metal coffee stills were sort of indigenous to this plantation. Today we have 3 of them on our operations, all of which date back to the early 1900s. They're similar to the wooden coffee still, with the exception that they're made of copper. And this is because at the turn of the 20th century, it was so difficult to maintain wood. And of course, with all the learning that copper is useful as a distilling material because it conducts well, it takes part in esterification, and therefore really enhances the decay of the product. One could imagine that more and more stills began to be made of copper as opposed to wood. And so the same occurred here at the Diamond Distillery. And we have, of course, kept those stills. So today we are able to boast the rich bouquet that comes from the copper coffee stills. We have 3 of them in total. I can tell you a unique difference in how we operate them is that we recycle the bottoms of the rectified spirit back to that first column. What that does, apart from ensuring we extract as much alcohol as possible, is to also recycle a lot of the heavier components. All right, so they get, in a way, rectified twice. All right, most of the components get rectified on the first pass, but that 5–10% that would ordinarily not receive attention gets a second pass. And so overall, it really enriches the richness of that bouquet. And so when I think of El Dorado and the wide, complex range of flavors that we're able to offer to the consumers through our products, it's a function of the number of stills that we have. It's a function of the richness of our process, but it's also a function of how we distill. We distill to ensure the way the stills get the product maximizes the impact of flavor. And the coffee stills are a good example of one such strategy. I can walk you through some slides just to quickly give you a sense of what those stills look like. I'll show both. So we have a Heritage Center where we house models of those stills. So I'll show you a clip of those as well as a shot of the actual still house, so you get a sense of the scale of the operations.
Starting from that really quick, that this is great that you have these models because it's really hard to get a good picture of the Versailles and the Port Morant stills.
It is very difficult. Well, unfortunately, because we've had to make do with the footprint at Diamond to bring all this history in one house, Sometimes you don't quite get the luxury of building on green field.
Yeah.
But, we are happy still to have them all properly housed. And yes, the models help to enhance the visuals. So with the double wooden pot still, you get a nice glimpse there of the double distillation process, the two wooden vats connected by the copper the copper gooseneck pipes that eventually lead to the copper retort where it's finally rectified before being condensed as product. And I talked about how the impact of the wood helps to ensure that the distillation process is elongated to allow for more of the heavier components to be distilled over into the product. The next shot, I think, shows, right. So this is an old photograph, admittedly. We have since had modifications to that still house. But I like this one because it gives you a very good view of the two vats connected by the copper goosenecks. And of course, you can see the age of the copper as a sign of it being in operation since 1732. All right, next we go to the wooden coffee. So again, this is a model of the two towers made entirely of wood. The second column has copper coils running through to allow for enhancement of the esters and the flavors. And so if we go to the slide after that, so again, this is an old photograph. This one dates back to 2006, when we would have done some substantial maintenance on the stills. A question that we often get is, gee, these are made of wood. How can they last for so long? And I like to remind people that, because of our equatorial presence and, the fact that we share the Amazon with Brazil, the wide variety of hardwood species is something that we're in no shortage for in Guyana. And the specific wood that we use in this instance, Greenheart, has such a high density that it is sought the world over because of its long life, its durability in the most exacting conditions. In fact, I think now there's been regulation to restrict the use of Greenheart. But nonetheless, because those stills are constructed with Greenheart, they're able to be in operation for all this time. And so every decade or so, we have a monthly program and a annual program of maintenance. But every decade or so, we might have to go do some little more substantial maintenance. But outside of that, those stills keep churning out their product year after year. And so this was a nice shot because a beauty shot because it shows what we were able to do back in 2006 at our last intervention.
Right. So it's just essentially, you can like every 10 years or so, you might have to replace a small portion of the still. So it's sort of slowly evolving over time. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I'm not so sure if it's evolving, but if we find that there's a substantial degradation in any small section, we focus on just that area. But I would imagine that the bulk of this still would actually have been as per original installation.
Right.
I've talked about the copper coffee stills, similar to the wooden coffee, except the copper is extremely useful in distillation and gives us a lot of the richness that we boast of for El Dorado.
And you have 2 sets of these, right?
3 coffee stills.
Okay.
And the next slide shows a model of the French Saval still with the 4 columns. Again, we can operate those in different modes, 2, 3, 4 columns, feed at different points, take cuts at different points to produce 9 different products. And so to give you a sense of what this still house looks like, so that's an overhead view. That's an overhead view showing our coffee stills, our Saval stills, and it's just all had to be fit into one premises. In 2010, in fact, when I joined the company in 2007, sort of my first task was to work along with the team in the planning and the designing and eventual construction and installation of our new distillery. And so there are 2 new stills. One, a 5-column still that is able to make almost any product within the light to medium bodied range. And the second, a 4th coffee still, which was geared towards expansion as well as exploration of different product profiles. So the older stills are very specific in terms of the product that they give. But we wanted to have a lot more flexibility to further explore how far coffee type stills can impact the sensory product of rums. And so we did install a new coffee still. It's fully automated. And so with that, we have been able to do some trials on new products, on new rum styles, on new flavor profiles. And eventually some of that will obviously find their way into the marketplace. So I've talked a lot about the distillation. To say a bit about our aging process. Again, being on the equator is hugely important because for a couple of reasons. Our climate is fairly consistent year-round. So our night and day temperature drop is minimal, 2-3 degrees, maybe 5 if it's a really cold night. That's Celsius, that is. It's hot and humid year-round. The humidity is, of course, extremely important for the aging process because it helps to accelerate those aging reactions. We have now documented a number of cases where we have aged simultaneously rums in temperate climates. And when compared with rums that were aged in Guyana, we do see that rapid maturation, both in terms of color development, in terms of the congener profile, in terms of the viscosity and density of the product. You really do get the sense of a much more mature product at comparable age. And so for us, we take pride in our aging warehouses because they really have enabled us to keep or to ensure that the quality of product we're looking for can get to the consumer.
So I was going to say, Shaun, real quick. So you have two sort of main aging facilities there. The one at Diamond, but then also in Iflot. Can you just briefly tell us about sort of like your different approaches in them, like why you might keep a barrel at one versus another, for example?
Sure. So we actually have 5 warehouses and counting, 3 at Diamond and 2 at Iflot. The warehouses at Iflot historically were used for holding the barrels on racks. Usually our older rums, so the rums that are intended for, much older expressions, as well as the rums that we want to keep for a long time with an intention of some release at a future date, we tend to keep those further away from the traffic at Diamond where, of course, there's a hive of activity. However, at Diamond, because a lot of the rums have a much shorter pass-through, so for instance, our 3 and 5 years, and even our younger expressions that go into the Diamond Reserve, those tend to be kept at Diamond just so that we can have much easier access and much higher pass-throughs. All right, so there's a combination of traditional racks or now storing on pallets at Diamond so that it's basically easier to handle.
Right, but everything comes back to Diamond eventually for bottling and so forth.
That is correct.
Yeah.
All right. In terms of aging, I want to talk a bit about the issue of the use of caramel in our rums. So again, this is a historical process. Rums that we would have sold traditionally to the UK and to Canada, and dating all the way back to, we've seen records in the 1920s, 1930s, 19-teens coming forward. A lot of those marks of rums would have been sold with caramel. So in those days, the rums were transported in barrels. All right, so the idea was not so much to age it as it was to use those barrels as a vessel for transportation. So the barrels were, they were produced, they were loaded into barrels from our rum storage tanks. We took a gauge of the quantity because that was required for customs purposes. And then whenever the vessel is here, it's arranged. The barrels are then regauged and then loaded onto the vessel. And the taxman takes his cut if he found that the losses from the barrels were too high. Of course, we know that in that process, the rum is actually aging because of contact with the wood, but that was nary the intention at the time. Fast forward, half a century later to the 1970s, so we are now an independent republic. With the change in regulation in the European Union, former colonies are now able to own brands. And so we very much determined that we would want to get into using a lot of those rums that were at that time held over and in our warehouses to develop brands. In those earlier days, there were many other brands that we would have walked through leading up to the early 1990s when, of course, the idea of El Dorado was birthed. So those rums that were drawn for those brands would have been rums that were put into barrels with caramel. Now, I would imagine that the use of caramel, in addition of caramel to rums, makes it a lot more palatable, and therefore, for an export market consumer base, it gives a lot more, allows for a lot wider spread in terms of being able to sell those rums to a much wider range of consumers.
Hey, Shaun, so when we talk the caramel, are we talking? It's not like it was not what the E150 would use today. It's like it was a sweeter caramel, right?
It is a sweeter caramel. The world has really changed because everything now has a very well-defined specification. Even for us, things that were not defined back in the day now have a specification, and caramel is a good example. Our traditional process relied on seeing that first smoke of when the caramelization process has reached the point where the sugars are now converted, and then we strike and end it right there because that's our sweet spot. Of course, now with the improvement in technology, we have been able to analyze the caramel in many different dimensions. One of the most important is, of course, the color, because that's one of the reasons why you use caramel to color the rums. E150 typically can take you well over 100,000 in terms of the color intensity units. Our caramel is roughly about a half of that, all right? So I would imagine from that, there is a lot of residual sugar that isn't fully caramelized. But you may ask the question, well, why have we kept it that way? Well, there's a good reason. In addition to the caramel, and caramel is a very intricate, very messy process. I say messy in the sense that it's not a linear reaction taking place. It's literally hundreds of reactions taking place simultaneously. And so you're only trying to average the effect of the caramel by controlling the conditions, but you can't obviously control each individual reactions. We have found that some of those reactions produce heavier components, produce chain components, long chain components that we do not want. Because at the end of the day, when the product is aged, they tend to haze out. So tannins, for example, tannins that tend to settle out in acidity are produced also in the caramelization process. We, of course, tried to experiment with getting the caramel up to higher colors to see what would happen. And we found that those undesirable effects started to step in. A lot of the bitter components started to step in. A lot more acid tannins were produced. And so for us, maintaining that sweet spot, just about 50 to 80,000 CIU is good for our product. And it's also consistent with the caramel that was used in our rums. The effect of that, however, is that there would be some amount of residual sugars that would go into the product. Nonetheless, so maintaining that practice of aging the rums with the caramel, again, the rums mature fairly quickly. There are a couple of other issues that come into play, however. One being that the source of water that we use has a very high minerality naturally. Now, every Caribbean island or country has different water profiles. So some, for instance, have high calcium content, so lots of hardness because of the presence of limestone and so on. That's not our problem. We don't have hardness in our water. We have a lot of other minerals, however, and we have found that that minerality increases the affinity for certain organic components in the rums. And so over time, they gradually chelate and settle out. All right. Why am I saying all of this? I'm saying all of this because if we take a few steps back, with the richness of the fermentation beer, that's one, that produces a wide range of components. Two, with our style of distillation that selects specific components with specific concentration so as to produce every batch with a full flavor profile. It means that what goes into the barrel already has a lot of chemical potential. When you add on top of that the fact that the water has a lot of minerality, and so over time it will naturally adhere to certain components. And in addition to that, we're adding caramel, all right, because this is the way this mark was always made. You add on top of that the climate. So because of the high heat and humidity and the high rate of evaporation of water, and so our angel share is high, of alcohol, our angel share is high. And so because of that high evaporation, you find that there's a higher concentration of the heavier components that remain behind, a higher concentration of those components that would have a high affinity for the minerality in the water, a higher amount of residual sugars that tend to remain behind because, of course, that does not evaporate preferentially as would the water. And so the net effect of all of this is that the aged rums have a higher density, they have a higher viscosity, all right? And so if you attempt to measure the alcohol strength with a hydrometer, you'll actually find that there's a very high obscuration, all right? So usually when you measure, let's take one of our fresh rums, for example. If you use a hydrometer, you expect the alcohol density to vary fairly linearly with concentration, and that's fine. But the moment your density begins to shift from that fresh alcohol state, then suddenly you find that there's a difference between what you measure with a hydrometer and the real strength. And that difference is called the obscuration. The higher the density, the higher the viscosity, the higher that obscuration value. And because of all of these influences that I've gone through earlier, our rums do have a very, very high density. As a result, the obscuration is high, and so if you measure with a hydrometer, there is the high obscuration. It, of course, increases with age. So we have checked 3-year-old rums, 5, 12, 25, older, and you do see that progression as the rums get older. I'm saying all of this because I know that there is a controversy that we have addressed that deals with the addition of sugar in rums. And we want to say categorically, that is not our standard, that is not our practice, all right? There is the traditional process, which we are transparent about, of using caramel in aged rums. And because of that, we do see that high obscuration when the strength is measured with, when the density is measured with the hydrometer, and that is converted to alcohol strength. I should say, however, as mentioned earlier, we have 5 warehouses now. We're actually planning for our 6th. Our goal is to, another 3 to 5 years, to double what we currently have in all of our properties. So with this expansion, we have done a couple of things. We have moved away from the reliance on reuse of barrels to injection of fresh barrels. By fresh, I mean freshly procured, once used, first select ex-bourbon barrels, all right? And the concept was, well, if there is more contact between the rums and fresh wood, then the effect of aging should be just as dramatic as if it were aged with caramel, let us say in a barrel that would have seen more cycles in the past. And so by extending our number of warehouse facilities, we're able to inject a much bigger pipeline of product that is aged without caramel. And I can say to you that some of that has already begun to come through into the consumer channels. And what we're finding is that the amount of those residual sugars have dramatically gone down. And so over time, as we evolve more and more in this direction, where we pretty much would discontinue the use of aging with caramel, except for special cases where, maybe it's part of the history. But certainly for our main products, where we evolve away, we certainly expect the amount of residual sugars that are measured to be reduced. The last thing I want to say on this issue is that if you measure the amount of sugars analytically in a laboratory, and you measure the obscuration with a hydrometer and try to convert that to sugar, we have found that the hydrometer method overcompensates because it assumes that everything is sugar. Everything is not sugar. All right. There are a lot of other components that are part of the aging process that also obscure that value. As a rule of thumb, we have found about 40% of what is resulting in the obscuration comes from sugar. The rest of it is actually those long chain fatty acids and organic acids that are produced starting from fermentation and then through the aging reactions in various ways. So all told, we are proud of what we do, but we are transparent about what we do as well. And we expect that as we implement the change in our aging strategy, that the consumer will see that coming through in our product.
Shaun, really quick, I want to touch back on a point you mentioned. I think you went by quickly, but I think is also important to understand. As I understand it, like when you would create a barrel, say back 20 years ago, you would put a fixed amount of caramel in, the amount you would normally put in a barrel, and it has a certain amount of sugar in it, of residual sugar. Now, if you measured the sugar density at that moment in time, it might have one value, but that over time, over 5 years, 10, 15, 21 years, the amount of alcohol and water may decrease, but the amount of sugar is remaining the same. So there's a sort of a net concentration effect. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. And so over time, that effect increases. So measuring, for example, a 15-year-old product or a 12-year-old product as opposed to a 5-year-old product, you'll see very different numbers.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note, like you said, you're moving away from using caramelized barrels, but it doesn't mean that if you have a 15-year product, you can't necessarily go make it with 15-year uncaramelized rum. You have to deal with the stock you have on hand.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
And so there'll be a period of time of which this is phased out and phased down, but the pipeline is there, and so that will take care of itself over time.
Okay.
Colleague Sharon, would you like to talk about our rums a little more, or your blending and your strategy and all that enriches the characteristics of our rums?
Okay, well, yes, my job, as I tell people, as the master blender becomes easy because the distiller has done a lot of the hard work and he has made the rum to the specification in terms of the flavor profiles that we are looking for. So characteristics of Demerara rum really range from very floral, fruity notes, which are common. And of course, they are rounded and smooth when they're aged. So that complements the entire aromatic profile. Because Shaun would have explained a lot about the minerality that comes from the water and the molasses that sometimes impart what we call a sea brine type of flavor in the rum. And then we also have notes that comes from the barrel aging process that we describe as spicy, nutty, grassy, vegetal, herbal, earthy. The ones that I commonly like in terms of the medium body rums are always the fruity, aromatic flavors. And I think those are the complex nature of the Demerara rum that we all see and love and characterize that, this is a good product. I think moving on to the other slide. Well, I think from my end on the blending side too, which because as I said, the distiller has given me a wide range of rums. We do over 24 different types of rum. So you can move from very light profiles to medium body, fruity profiles to heavy body, robust rum. So it becomes much easier to be consistent with the profiles that you're looking for. So in our El Dorado range, you will know that we have from the 3 and 5, which are really what we call mixers. You could make your mojito, you could do that mixing with the 3-year-old. You have good rums there. Then we do have the 8-year-old, which is somewhere in the middle there. It's a sort of premium mixer there. And then the 12, 15, 21, which is the sipper, premium sipper. People are always familiar with the fruity nature of the 12-year-old. It has a lot of oakiness to it. And also the 15-year-old. I mean, that's my personal favorite, as I tell people. The 15-year-old, this is a heavy body type of rum that has very robust flavor. You can taste the pot still inside. And then the 21-year-old is sort of a more, I refer to that as a more aromatic flavor rum, medium body. So, when I normally do my hand when I talk, so I would say it's like the 12, the 15 goes up, and the 21 comes down back on the flavor profile. But it's the kind of rums that, you have one for everybody's palate, basically. And that's what we ensure that we give to the consumer. I think at this stage, I don't want people to ask about, okay, what do you have? I mean, we do have rums in stock that we can look at the future for in terms of age. And, there are things that we are working on. I want to give it out at this stage, but we want to continue also with our special finishes, which we would have done in the last 4 to 5 years. So I do have some of that in stock that is going to come out at some point. Future rums, we can look at cast strength rums, that we have done for the rare collection. I mean, there's a lot of persons asking for that, the consumers, and we can go along in that range too. So I think we do have a lot in store.
Yeah. So Sharon, how many marks is sort of your palette you have available, and how many do you typically work with for the
well, as I said, 24 different ones. I mean, quite a range, starting from the light rums straight on to a medium floral aromatic to heavy body. Typical range is 10 to 12. I normally work around those.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I know people are they love the high ester topic, like the high ester mark that you make. Like, are there any, like, where do you use them, and are there any rums that, like, there's more of those that people might try?
Well, I know, yes, you have said, it's high ester is a topical issue now. So we are definitely looking at futuristic products for that. We've had that in our 50th anniversary rum, so that it's there. And we also do some amount of that maybe for other blends that we don't put in the El Dorado range.
Okay, good to know. So for you, what is what are some of the unique challenges of being a master blender that you think people aren't really aware of?
I think it's ensuring there's a lot of responsibilities on the shoulders, as I keep saying, because it's ensuring that people get the product that they're accustomed to and they like. Consistent. I think that's the most challenging part, to make sure that I can do that consistently and the consumers are not disappointed when they have the product or they taste the product and said, oh, this is not what I'm accustomed to.
Yeah. I would imagine there's a fair amount of spreadsheets and just the logistics of, like tell us about that, like to have not only product range, but also special editions. What's that like?
Well, the spreadsheets, as I said, sometimes we could get what they said, paralysis analysis. We could go through all of that, and but to simplify the job, I just spend a lot of time on making sure that I do the lab sample well, so that when I do the bulk, it's fairly consistent and there's not a lot of tweaking I have to do at the end. Because again, that's a cost, that's time, and a lot of things you have to balance. So you try to make sure it's right at the beginning of it. And as I said, my job becomes easier because with consistency we have in the marks themselves from the distillation phase, I think it's easier. We just monitor to make sure nothing gets off track, basically.
Yeah, but you have to project, many years into the future, don't you? And then that in turn affects other decisions, like day-to-day decisions.
Yes. Well, with our marketing team, who would normally help us to make sure that we have a direction, we project 25, 30 years in the future. So that's what we have to sit down, and then of course have a buffer to make sure that if there is a trend of moving, let's say the 12 is increasing or the 15, we can make sure the marks are available for that product 12, 15, 21 years down the road. So that's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you don't just run all the stills flat out all the time and make whatever rum you can. Like, you have to target what stills you're distilling at any given moment.
Yes, and the Master Distiller has been very good at that too. Yeah. So they manage that process very well for us.
Okay. Cool. So I have a few other questions, and I promise we'll get to some of the viewer questions, but just a few things I wanted to ask. The Guyana, it has a geographical indication, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Shaun, or either of you, can you share anything about that? Or I think people aren't aware of this.
Well, we are in the process of registering our Demerara rum geographical indication in Europe. But we've already registered same in Guyana and some of the Caribbean territories. So it helps to capture the essential aspects of Demerara rums in terms of the product profiles and links that to the geographical origin. So what are the specific environmental, what are the microclimate aspects, what are the specific microbiological species that are present here, that are part of our process, our fermentation process, part of the molasses coming in that help to enrich the process. And of course, the aspects of history and heritage. Our distillers have very long careers. If you survey, there's an average of 25, 30 years. And so that really helps to ensure the intergenerational pass on of knowledge, of practices, and generally of the know-how of the product, of which knobs to turn, of the craft, the art, the science of what we do. And so capturing all of that and maintaining that essence in every bottle is something that we are very passionate about, hence the geographical indication.
Okay, so let's jump to some audience questions here. First one, I'm sort of prioritizing based upon how many likes they have. Is it true that originally that the French Cheval still was used to make the ICBU, Skeldon, Le Bon Intention, Blairmont, and marks?
All correct.
Yes. Okay. And have you started making these newer marks? Are these marks on the newer MPRS still, or they remain on the Saval still?
Most of the ones you've mentioned have remained on the Saval still, because the focus with the newer still was efficiency as well as volume. Many of the patent marks that are on the French Saval stills tend to be of smaller volume. The Albion, the Le Bon Intentions, for example. And so we've kept those there, but we've migrated some of the lighter ones, like the Skeldon, for example. That one has moved across to the newer still.
Okay. I told you high ester keeps coming up. Next question from Keegan says, will DDL increase production of high ester rum for the ester heads? I think that sounds like a yes. So, okay, I think we addressed this, but just to give you, in case you have anything else you want to add, it says, given the increasing demand for transparency in unadulterated rums, how is DDL planning to address this demand?
But I think that we want to start talking more about the actual measured sugar content in the rums, so that consumers are aware that, yes, there is this high residual content, but in tandem with that is an understanding of where the measured sugar content comes from, right? And I've walked through the process, and we have to find a way to make that condensable so that the average consumer can get in a nugget okay, this is sugar, this is the sugar content, and this is where it's coming from. Like I said, however, we expect this issue will become less and less of a prominent one for us as we move away from aging with caramel entirely over time.
Okay. Next question. How old are your rum stocks? And are the barrels aged in open shed or closed type buildings?
They're aged in closed buildings. Well, we've released a 50th anniversary rum in 2016, which was 2/3, 50 years old. So that gives you a sense of how deep we go, how far back we go.
Okay. And open shed, so you have both open shed or closed type buildings, or I think my impression are all sort of somewhat exposed to the air fairly frequently.
They're all closed, but there's provision in the structure of the buildings for ventilation. And so, yes, there's interaction with the northeast trade winds that come from the ocean, but the buildings themselves are closed, but with allowance for ventilation.
Okay. Next question. My understanding is that the high humidity you described for your aging facilities will substantially lower the alcohol percentage. Can you tell us what percentage you typically go into the barrel at for the expressions you're targeting for long-term aging?
Yes. So we typically go at 70, and the reason is that so our humidity is on average 70%. It usually can get much higher than that, 80, 85, 90, but 70 is sort of an average. And so by equalizing with what the average humidity is, we have found that we have reduced substantially what the angel share is. I can tell you over a decade ago when we aged a lot of our rums at 80, 84%, our angel share far exceeded 10% per annum. We've been able to bring that down to a half to 2/3 of that just by adjusting the strength at which we age, currently 70%. Coming out on the back end, it depends on the age. You can get, 10%, 15% drop in the alcohol strength just by the angel share.
And so what is your typical, so what was your angel share before you started adjusting things, and then what is a typical angel share now?
So it has moved from about 11% average to about 7% currently.
Oh, wow.
Of course, there's a range, so it's like between 5 to 9, 7 on average, as opposed to being 9 to 13, 11 on average.
Right. So there's another question, goes back to the caramel, is can you expand on the process you use to make the caramel that you described? Like, I think people want a little more about that.
Okay, so it's based on caustic soda. So we use a defined concentration of caustic, which we add to the sugar, the refined sugar. Of course, it's well mixed. It's then heated in a closed pot, pressure vessel. And then we monitor the temperature from the point of where the solution starts to boil all the way up to caramelization. At the moment, we get up to about between 185 on the very, very low end, on the very high end, 195. Typically, we like to be between 190, 192, 193, because that's the point where we find that so when the caramelization process reaches its peak, there are a lot of brown vapor that's given off as the caramelization process really, really accelerates. And so we want to stop it just there. And so at that point, we basically basically condense the mixtures to allow for any further caramelization. And yeah, we then allow the batch to cool, and then we go for our analysis. Okay. So it's based on caustic, and it's based on the first sign of those vapors, those brown vapors that are very, very sweet smelling. So it tells us that there's the onset of caramelization. If you go, and you'd be surprised going 1 or 2 degrees above that, and the dramatic change on the quality of caramel, on the color as well as on the taste of the caramel, that results just by going 1 or 2 degrees above that. So we have to be very, very rigorous. All right. So there's very little space between going from, let us say, a color of 60,000 to a color of 120,000 just by having 1 or 2 degrees. So if you miss your shot, sometimes the batch is spoiled.
So that reminds me, there was a question I forgot from previously, but the caramel, if you were to go back in time, say 20 years or 30 years, when putting caramel in the barrels was common, would you say that it was a practice across all the rums, or were only certain heavier marks caramelized? Like, was it like what was that story?
That's a very good question because, and again, it goes back to the distillery of origin. So not all distilleries would have sold their rums with caramel. We have to put our minds in a 18th, 19th century era when Guyana had over 300 distilleries, all or most of them independently owned by small plantation owners, and so they had a complete freedom to do what they would do to meet the markets that they would satisfy. So there was a huge hodgepodge of practices in terms of which rums were aged with caramel, which ones were not.
Right.
To give you an example, so the copper coffee stills, for example, a lot of that is aged with caramel. The double wooden pot still, a lot of that was not aged with caramel. The wooden coffee still, a lot of that was not aged with caramel. So it does vary by the specific origin of the particular mark. All right, not only in terms of the plantation and the still, but also in terms of even the very practice of whether the rum was sold with caramel or sold without. All right. So when our blender put the rums together, and I'm now going back to the 1990s, I do not think that they were thinking about caramel content. Right? They were looking at making a good product.
Mm.
But the fallout of that is we're now left with a recipe that that uses some rums with and some rums without. All right. And for that very reason, you'd find in the El Dorado range, apart from the influence of age, there's some of our portfolio offerings that have very low residual sugars because they benefit substantially from rums that were not aged with caramel.
Okay.
I don't know, 5 years is a good example of that. Same for the 3.
Right, because I know, for example, let me rephrase. So it sounds like what you're saying is based on sort of historical practice of the mark, you may or may not have caramel may or may not have been added to the barrel. And so, like, I know some enthusiasts, they're collecting, say, independently bottled rums, like a 1997 skeleton. I'm just making that up, but and sort of like measuring and trying to say, is there sugar or not, and trying to make sense of of this all. And it seems like it's further complicated because some rums weren't aged with caramel, some were, and so it's hard to sort of make any sort of blanket statement about the sugar in the rums. If you go back 15 or 20 years, there's many factors that went into it. Is that a fair? Yeah.
Right. And bear in mind that we were first ISO certified in 1995. So that was, and Sharon was part of that process. I'm sure she can tell you a lot better about that than I can. But from my understanding, that was a massive exercise in documenting a lot of what those historical practices were, so that there, as ISO attempts to do, so there's consistency in the process and in the product going forward. So all of that helped to nurture the culture of what was done with a specific mark of rum.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna jump ahead on the slightly less liked question, but it's one of near and dear to my heart. And Shaun, I remember you and I had a spirited discussion about this at dinner my last night there. It says, what evidence do you have that the Port Morant still was built at least by 1732? And then is there evidence that the still was at the Port Morant estate at the time? I
can tell you that Guyanese have not been very efficient with their record keeping. A lot of the historical records that we have been able to refer to, we were only able to do so because of British archiving. I can tell you, for example, I'm digressing a little, but to make an important point, I was part of a presidential commission on lands to ascertain the history of acquisition of lands in the colony and then, of course, in the Republic of Guyana. And many of those records, even in our local archives, are not available. You have to go to The Hague for the Dutch era. You have to go to London for the British era. All right. So I would be the first to admit that I think we as a society, and this is going now centuries ago, are guilty of not being as scrupulous with our record keeping. I think, however, that does not negate the history and the pass on of knowledge from generation to generation, which we have begun to capture. All right. Beyond that, I think we can, and this is this discussion we had that last night, that if we think about this logically, right? So the entire world of distillation, has moved in a certain direction. So we know they started with pot stills, but pot stills restricted the throughput, 16 hours for 300 gallons, when the same quantity can be gotten in less than an hour. So obviously, invent continuous stills, so that in less than an hour you can get the same quantity. And the first known example of that is the wooden coffee still. First patented in 1830, ours was built in 1880 at Plantation and more. But then wood is still difficult to maintain, and the world over, wood is not as available as it is in Guyana. So with that, coupled with the observation that copper is very useful, distillation began to move away from wood into metals, particularly copper, but also stainless steel and so on. So by moving towards metal continuous stills, you solve the problem of restriction in capacity. You solve the problem of difficulty of maintaining, of high alcohol losses, and you see that trajectory the world over. I think what is different in Guyana is that in addition to modernizing and installing the newer type of stills in each era, the older ones were kept. And we were able to do so because we were 300 distilleries at one stage, all right? And we had 300 distilleries, frankly, because we're much bigger than the Caribbean territories, all right? Our coast alone is substantially bigger than most of the Caribbean islands that you can refer to, all right? So it would not make sense that a still that is particular to a specific era would be installed in an era when the world was moving away from it. That would be the textbook definition of being apocryphal.
Right. Yeah, I think my take on it is that there certainly could be some aspects of that of the Port Morant still existing in 1732. I think it's possible, like it maybe evolved over time, and like it itself, like the design of it changed over time. Like maybe there wasn't the retort there initially. This is a fascinating topic for me. So
yes,
okay.
You are correct.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Next question. So I think we addressed it briefly, but so what type of yeast do you use in the fermentation process? Any specific varietals or anything unusual that you want to comment on?
Standard dry yeast. But like I said, there's also the impact of the native wild yeast, which we allow in the process, because that only helps to enrich the beer. But that's secondary. The primary agent is standard dry yeast.
Right.
No specially cultured strain.
Yeah. And so as I understand it, my recollection is that there are some tanks which are closed, some fermenters which are closed, and those would presumably only get the standard dry yeast. And the other tanks which are open, those would be where you get the natural yeast. Is that a fair statement?
But let's also remember that the impact of the environment in storage is also evident.
Okay.
All right. So in our storage tanks, they all commingle, and so you would have some amount of the yeast going through. In fact, if we are not scrupulous to keep water out of our storage, you'd see fermentation taking place from there. So just by diluting the molasses and therefore reducing the osmotic pressure, those wild yeast naturally kick into gear.
Okay. Next question, a fun one. I think this has come up a lot in the forums. Is when a label says IFLOT, what's the most likely mark on the bottle?
ICBU.
ICBU? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sharon, would you tell us about your ideals and strategies when you develop a new blend?
Well, some of the blends, the Dorado blends, let's say the 12 and the 15, I would have inherited when I came. But the 8-year-old, for example, I can talk about that one because I developed that. So basically, what it comes back to what profile we were looking for. So I would have in my head a profile that I will target. So if I want to look for something aromatic or fruity, then the profile I will have to develop using a medium body rum. Of course, I'm guided by marketing because sometimes they would also advise if that's the profile they might be interested in. But take for example, as I said, the 8-year-old. We were looking for something fruity, estery, aromatic. So we look for rums that are in that sort of flavor profile. So that was developed. And as you know, our El Dorado range are blended rum. So we can use 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of marks and put them together.
Okay. The question from Ivar said, you mentioned adding straight sugar doesn't fit with your quality requirements. How is that different from adding sugar through the addition of caramel?
Well, we're not adding sugar through the addition of caramel. Remember that this is all post-facto analysis of a traditional process. All right, so historically, caramel was added to the rums. The caramel was produced a certain way. Post-facto, and in light of the conversation on sugar, we have gone back to do the detailed analysis on what the composition of that caramel is, and did find that yes, it does have a higher amount of sugars. And it is for that reason that as we expand our warehouse facilities, we are moving away from adding rums with caramel. So it's an issue of the heritage and the practice and the traditional. It's also an issue of what the pipeline of rums that we have in stock that is still being exhausted, and an issue as well of us recognizing the issue of sugar needs to be addressed and doing so frontally by moving away from aging rums with caramel. When those rums come fully of age, then you will see the impact on the product.
A couple more questions and we'll wrap up here. When it comes to barrel management, do you actively manage the aging, like move around barrels, or do you pretty much leave them alone?
If I can take this one, it's a combination of both. There are some rums that we, especially if we age with a particular asterisk or with a particular intention, for an innovation purpose or futuristic purpose, we obviously would periodically do an analysis of that product. In every case, we typically would decant the barrels in 2 to 3 years for the purpose of regaging, and those rums that are of high interest, we'd also take an analysis of it at that stage. Outside of that, most of the rums, however, go in and out, and every 2 or 3 years they are rebarreled, regaged, and put back. We only focus on the ones that are of high interest to us.
Okay. And last question. I know this is near and dear to people, and you may not be able to comment on this specifically, but I know it's near and dear to people's hearts. Tiki files in Europe are starved for a 151 proof Demerara rum a la Lemon Heart 151. Would you consider making something in that style for the European market?
I think we aim to please the consumer. So if we are getting that sort of request, I'm hoping my marketing colleagues are listening, because it really starts there. They give us the charge, and then Sharon and I get to work after. We are usually the background people. So I think once our marketing team says yes, absolutely, we'll get into work.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of demand for it here. Like in the U.S. we have it. There's been a lot of demand from European bartenders. So, well, cool. That's we're about out of time. Thank you for being with us. This has been wonderful. I think we've shared some great information. Will, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I just want to say thank you, echo what Matt said. Thank you, Shaun and Sharon. This was so cool. I know I was off screen, but I was smiling and just listening intently the whole time. It was fascinating. So really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you everyone who came out. Tons of good questions. And I know we didn't have time to get to them all, but maybe at some point we'll just have to have El Dorado back on again to talk El Dorado rum a little more. But yeah, Shaun, Sharon, any final words before we go?
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Will, for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. So, and stay safe during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Will, and thanks to everyone who joined us. I just want to underscore that we live for you, right? All of what we do, all the hard work, that labor of love goes into just ensuring that you get the product you want each time. Matt earlier asked about, how those spreadsheets are. I can tell you, there are hundreds of lines and they go dozens of columns across because for every market we maintain, there has to be a pipeline to keep that product flowing. And it has to be a growing pipeline as more and more people demand El Dorado and the richness that we put into every bottle. So have no fear. We're here to address your every concern. Sugar, quantity, quality, everything. We're here to be transparent and to meet your need. Thank you.